So welcome everyone. It's really nice to see you here. And I'm very happy to have Mianna Meskus with us. Mianna is an advisory board member of Creatures and an associate professor of sociology and science and technology studies in Tampere University in Finland. Mianna recently joined Creatures because we had a lot of these ethical questions. We got a lot of questions from our reviewers. So it really functioned as an opportunity to rethink our kind of research practices and how we work with creative practitioners at Creatures. So we've asked her to kind of share her experience and thought about, methodological and ethical issues that in conducting speculative research. Mianna has a lot of experience in that, and so I'm very excited to have this really special seminar today. I won't say much more. Mianna, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you for inviting me to this very, very exciting group, first of all, to the project and to this seminar also. I have to say I'm out of my comfort zone here. I'm very excited about presenting to you because I'm a social scientist and that's where I usually present my stuff. So it's very, very fruitful and exciting for me to be presenting here. But I'll share the screen now. And I'll try to be brief. But I'm going to present a paper that I'm writing together with a PhD student at Aalto Design, Emilia Tikka, and trying to verbalize to you what we are thinking about, what our observations about the methodological implications of this kind of speculative collaborations can be. This is obviously nothing normative or nothing not that systematic, but I want to introduce to you this idea of working in the gap of uncertainty that we are working on in my research group related to speculative collaboration. But just to say some words about my background. So as Christina said, I'm a sociologist. I'm a science and technology studies scholar. And my work has always revolved around the quite broad and anthropological issue of how the conditions of humanity are being shaped in contemporary societies. And my work has always been about medical knowledge, the ethics and politics of biology, biomedicine, and tinkering with the human body. And I recently conducted an ethnographic research project with or on stem cell science. I ended up doing a book that I published a couple of years ago with Palgrave Macmillan on scientific craft work. It's called Craft in Biomedical Research, and it's really about this revolutionary stem cell technology that was awarded the Nobel Prize when I started my research work on the futures of stem cell science and what promises it has for human modification and biomedical treatment. And that work has led me quite surprisingly for myself, perhaps not for you, to these speculative encounters with different participants. And that is what I'm trying to make sense of for my part today. So this is the background, but the paper that I'm trying to flesh out to you briefly here today is, as I said, co-authored with Emilia Tikka, who is a PhD student at Aalto and has been working in my project, and we supervise her with Julia Lohman at Aalto. And based on these several research cases, we have written a paper called Speculative Approaches in Social Science and Design Research, Methodological Implications of Working in the Gap of Uncertainty. And this has been revised and resubmitted at Qualitative Research. So it's one of the key methodology journals, peer-reviewed journals in social science, and yeah, mainly in social science. But there have been several papers on speculative research approaches in that journal also. Two lines of work that across with or kind of overlap with this paper is first of all my own research on reproductive futures and a paper I published in Feminist Theory last year, and it's kind of that reports on the speculative element or dynamic or aspect of my fieldwork with stem cell scientists, something that I couldn't fit in the craft book, but something that didn't leave me alone, and something that I needed to make sense of in terms of what kind of speculative engagement I ended up conducting with the scientists on reproductive futures, and in particular about using stem cells and this kind of reprogramming technology to craft synthetic gametes in the laboratory. So in mice, that technology has been already done, proven. In humans, it's unquestionably more complex, but it's a possibility of future, which would obviously change our ways of understanding how reproduction works if we could make synthetic gametes in the laboratory. Then the other paper that relates to this work I'm presenting today is with Lotta Hautamäki, who also works in the same research group, and this one looks at the later stages of life, so from reproduction to aging, and it's a paper on speculative engagement with elderly people on bioscience and the body, and kind of I'll tell you more about it in a minute, but it's based on a focus group events with elderly people to think about how biotechnology could modify human aging and what kinds of implications could that have. So these are the thematics that has brought me to speculative approaches. Now, you all know, as it has been said, that speculation is rampant in all kinds of places and directions. For us, because we're trying to move between social science and design research, so somewhere at a more kind of interdisciplinary broad level. So we define, or we use speculative approaches to denote to a philosophically driven aspiration, an interest on knowledge production, together with research participants, particularly on the topics of science, technology, and future. So very broad, very understanding speculation in a very broad sense. And I'm sure this is all common sense and common knowledge to you also, that speculation in itself, both in design research and in social science research, has been kind of emphatically argued not to constitute a method. And it has been said that it can't constitute a method, and it shouldn't constitute, because it's supposed to be this kind of open-ended, even playful engagement and conduct of research and engagement with participants on very serious matters. I must say, I mean, we all know that the playfulness is in the kind of conducting the materialities and the value engagements of research. But the point we want to make, and that's what kind of that hasn't left myself alone in entering this type of speculatively oriented social science research, is that they are not methodologically innocent, although they are not aiming, or they are not grounded in a set methods toolbox. So if we accept that they are not methodologically innocent. What does that mean? And we have used, we have been reading a Belgian philosopher and a chemist and a key pioneer in feminist science studies and science and technology studies, scholar Isabel Stengers's work, to think about speculative research as it is operationalized in empirical settings. So as you might know, Stengers is a well-known philosopher of science. She has particularly done great thinking work and kind of bringing and translating Alfred North Whitehead's process ontology into present day thinking about scientific knowledge, knowledge production in general, and the kind of radical idea that we should not bifurcate nature into objects out there and subjects, meaning making subjects here, but it really, this process ontological speculative philosophy is about how knowledge emerges from experience, and this experience pertains to scientists, but also to other participants of knowledge production. And that's something that we try to tap into in this work of ours. So this is really the theoretical backbone of the work that we are doing and the methodological thinking that we are trying to develop. Stengers has used Whitehead's very complex or difficult concept of interstice to emphasize the in-between character of life, or rather to emphasize that something interesting happens in these in-between situations, in the gaps, so to say. And for Stengers, the gap is where knowledge production can encounter and address, and I quote her, the unknown constituted by multiple diverse worlds. So it's really about what is interesting in knowledge production when we are head-on involved with something that emerges from in between, something that is very much based on not knowing. And how does experience relate to this not knowing that arises from the gaps or the interstices? And this idea is particularly relevant and interesting for us, the idea that because questioning the basis of knowledge, so advocating, for example, not knowing or being interested in the situations and elements of where knowledge hierarchies are rearranged, because we're interested in these kinds of situations, Stenger says that they engender fright. Questioning the basis of knowledge engenders fright. They are frightful situations, and for that reason, she says, interstices tend to close rapidly. So it's the way scientific knowledge production works is that these in-between situations, not knowing, these gaps are kind of frightening, and this not knowing is trying to be solved as quickly as possible. And we take this as a methodological cue for us. So if we think of speculative research engagements as these kind of stages or events within the research process, where the kind of basis of knowledge hierarchies are being questioned, where uncertainties are being explicitly thought about, where the value of not knowing is kind of uplifted, then we need to do something. Kind of the idea is that let's focus. Let's try not to let this interstice to close rapidly. Let's try to arrest our analytical gaze on what actually happens in the gap of speculation. What does it set in motion? Where does it lead us as scholars? And what does participating as researchers or as research participants in these mutual co-constitutive events mean? So that's the basis. That's kind of the philosophically oriented basis of what we've been doing. And the gap for us is quite practical. It's, instead of using the concept of interstice, which is very difficult and has a baggage of its own, we've used and developed the kind of the figure of the gap as a conceptual tool to highlight what takes place in these speculative research engagements. What kind of methodological issues could we be thinking about when we focus on the gap, when we don't allow the gap to close too quickly or try to explain it away just by saying that, okay, this is the nature of open-ended speculative research. Let's think about what is happening. So aligning with the speculative research approaches, the gap, the figure of the gap denotes to the open-endedness of the process and the value of not knowing. And it also asks us to be aware of and willing to recognize these unsettling situations. It's not business as usual, at least for us, for myself and others as social scientists, to conduct this kind of speculatively oriented research engagements. Because, at least for how we interpret it, and following Stenger's speculative philosophy, it's really very much about what she calls the suppressment of hierarchy. And this denotes to a knowledge production itself, and also to who are the people who are taking part in speculative engagement. So who are being asked to envision, for example, about biotechnology futures? Who has the valid knowledge to think about, to contribute to this kind of speculative thought experiments? And this leads us to the observation that is very well known to you, that this type of research is very much grounded in relations. It's a relationality of the whole business that cannot be undone. And that means that we have to methodologically think about what is it that happens when we engage in these events. How are we being affected as researchers ourselves while we ask for or invite participants to take part in these different kinds of research events? So just to reiterate, working in the gap of uncertainty is mutually constitutive. And what has been very interesting for myself and us in thinking through the case studies that we've been conducting is how it repositions, how speculative research in particular asks us to reposition ourselves. And it's not all research led. So it's more kind of, it invites to this dismantling or suppressment of hierarchy in rather surprising ways at some point. So surprising for a social scientist at least, and maybe for designer, art practitioner and researcher, there are some self-evident points that I make that could be kind of methodologically fleshed out more robustly also in design and in design research. I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments and experiences on this. But this is the basis from where I speak today. And these are the four case studies that we go through in the paper and based on which I'm talking today. So first is Emilia's practice-led design engagement in laboratory that took place in Germany a couple of years ago with bioscientists on the so-called CRISPR-Cas gene editing technology. And we go through this in this order for the sake of a storyline in the paper. Then we go to a social science case, which was this, as I said, focus groups with elderly people that took place in Finland just before the pandemic hit us. And we had many hours of conversations with elderly people on the possibilities and risks of biotechnological modification of aging and aging in general, whether it is what biomedicists, some of them understand as a disease that should be tempered or modified in some way. Then the third case is this ethnographic project that I already mentioned, interviews with European stem cell scientists and the synthetic gametes prospect. And the fourth one is Emilia's ongoing PhD research that has developed into design collaboration with a reindeer herder living in the Finnish Arctic on the future of the more than human relations and biotechnological modification in that case. So two cases of kind of more traditional design research and two cases of more traditionally social science research. And I'm going to present to you four observations and no more, then to conclude. But first idea that I want to share with you, or observation that links to the methodological issues of speculative research as we see it, is that researchers are really asking the participants to position themselves in certain ways in the name of speculative openness. So this is something that kind of relates to the idea that, okay, we're trying to do this kind of suppressing of the hierarchy and collaborative knowledge production, but even that asks the study participants to conduct themselves in some way. So what is being asked from the participants in the name of speculative research is the question here. And according to our observation, and this has been shown in previous research also, and it would be interesting to hear about your experiences, is that oftentimes participants struggle to step out of their everyday frames of reference. So, for example, imagining of biotechnology futures is more challenging than we might think. And this challenge that we place on researchers, on research participants, whether they are scientists or so-called lay people, is of relevance to the speculative research engagements. So achieving this so-called suppressment of hierarchy in knowledge production it requires work, and it's not self-evident, and you can fail, and you can kind of be left puzzled that what kind of a speculative did we get to really in-depth thinking of possible different forms of futures, or how do we go beyond the typical utopia, dystopia binary, for example. And the first case we talk about is Emilia's case with the scientists, laboratory scientists on this gene editing technology, and trying to discuss in the paper the kind of quite self-evident observations that scientists are not as free to speculate with the artist or as the artist, being representatives of the scientific institution. And you know, a lot of some of design and art research tries to enter the laboratory and really engage with scientists in the laboratory, and the conditions condition the way laboratory scientists can and are willing to speculate on how, for example, gene editing might be applied in the future. So they might be quite reluctant to think about these non-proven, scientifically proven futures, and they are speculative research kind of invites but asks and guides people to step out of their comfort zones, and it's not easy, and it may not work. Then the second thought or methodological observation that I want to take up here is another one that relates to the relationality of researchers and the research participants, and what researchers ask participants to be in the speculative research encounters. In how are they invited to take part in this research? And this, as you might know, has been something that particularly speculative design research has been, or there has been kind of critical discussion on the issue of who is the we who's doing these speculations. What is the group consisting of people who are asked to envision different types of stuff and create or take part in collaborative conversations on different issues of the world and in the present and the future. Who is this we? And in here again, in the name of speculative research, in the name of envisioning futures, for example, researchers are asking participants to position themselves in certain ways. So although we are, the overall aim is to do this open-ended, kind of accessible knowledge production that doesn't necessarily even aim for public engagement in science or more understanding in some technology developments, but just wants to speculate where are we going to as humans in terms of science and technology, for example. It's not self-evident that it's kind of free in a sense, and there's always a position that researchers invite the participants to be in, or at least in the beginning. And here's an example from the elderly people in the focus group. So we got some other critical comments from them in the paper, but I wanted to take this up. So even before we actually got into working with them and doing discussing what biotechnology could do to reproduction and aging in the future, in all of the groups, at least one person took up the question of who are we to speak about aging futures? Who are we supposed to represent? Who are we to do the justification work for technological development? And one of the retired teacher said in this way, so we are here speaking amongst a bunch of people that have seen and read all kinds of stuff. And he went on saying, people in my small town supermarket cashier queue would consider this discussion as plain utopia. They would say this is complete rubbish. So he was kind of, from the very outset, asking, who are we to say about this? And what is our expertise in this? And who are we to represent? And that is an interesting methodological kind of inbuilt hierarchy related situation in speculative research approaches in our view. And it's a process where the we is being constructed also along the way, if you are willing to do it. And it also highlights the risks of this type of research venture. You might end up in suppressing the hierarchy, you might end up in interesting situations. Okay, so then the third observation. The challenge turns also towards ourselves as researchers. So the task of repositioning is not only from the researchers to the research participants, but since and if you are willing to conduct speculative research in an open-ended manner and really embrace this idea of suppressing the hierarchy, there might be invitations for yourself as a researcher to step out of your comfort zone too. This is very much what I have experienced as a social scientist, and I acknowledge it might be a very different experience and more usual for you as research or design and art practitioners and makers and researchers. So you expect this to happen, but I haven't been expecting this to happen that much, coming from the methodological background that I have. But I want to take it up here anyways. So in all of our cases, we see this kind of affective reorientation that the participants invoke. They ask researchers to be affectively and emotionally engaged in the speculation in a different way that we perhaps ourselves expected to. This is just one very simplified example of an encounter that I had in an interview with a stem cell scientist. You know, I was very much focused on what is happening in the lab. What is this iPS cell technology? How does it work? What are its promises? What is the cell material like? And there were I had an idea of where the research was going, and then there were these moments when different study participants kind of invited me into the speculative engagements. And in the beginning, I was reluctant to do it because I felt that I am stepping outside the role of a researcher, social scientist that I had assigned for myself. And this conversation goes like this. So researcher says, I would certainly not get involved in anything that has to do with reproductive modification. And I asked, why do you feel so? And he says, so producing a living person. And I asked, why not? And he says, so would you want to be the first genetically modified person in the world? And he gives a laugh, a kind of a confused laugh. And I'm insistent. I'm saying, that's what I am asking you. And he says, I am asking you. And then I give a confused laugh and I say, okay, but I'm reluctant to pursuing this further. And he goes on saying, would you want to be the world's first chimeric person? I would not want to be, and I don't want to be involved in making one. And we're trying to make a case in the paper about these small instances of affective relationality that takes place in the gap of uncertainty, where the roles and positions are shifting. And I think that is both the promise and the risk of this type of speculative engagements. But we need to be aware of them, and we can make a point or develop more kind of methodological awareness of these types of happenings. And then the fourth and the final observation relates to temporality. So in addition to research participants maybe pushing researchers to be effectively involved in a different way in the speculative engagement, in thinking about futures, They might also ask us to rethink our temporal orientation or our understanding of what future is and how we can say something about futures or how we can conduct research on futures. So the challenge of co-imagining the future may require a shift of temporality, and this is the case with Emilia's PhD research, and it's also the case with the focus group people that we are writing the paper on the lived temporalities about. So both of these cases showed us that quite often the engaging with participants to think about futures actually require us to turn around and to look into the past. And this has been for us an experience that has really been invoked by the participants, a temporal reorientation from their part. Emilia's work is ongoing, and you might have a chance to hear her speak at some point about her research in more detail. However, what she's working on now is a speculative story on these human-animal futures, and an engagement and collaborative research that she has done with this reindeer herder showed that they could not access, so to say, they didn't get to think about futures before Emilia had agreed to think with this reindeer herder about pasts and about quite long lineages of past ways of herding reindeer in the Finnish Arctic. So the whole setting of the story that Emilia is constructing as part of her PhD work is this idea of what happens to thinking about and making futures in design research when you really engage also with or engage with futures through the past. And she's constructing this kind of a world after an ecological collapse, where epigenetic modification is used as a technique to remember reindeer herding pasts. It's a speculative story, but it's grounded in this these collaborators reminiscent of the past ways of doing reindeer herding and how it has changed due to technological development. So to conclude, some thoughts. This is the dilemma that I think maybe we all share if we try to think about speculative research in terms of methodology, that creating the gap of speculative engagement is both the aim of the research event, that's where you get your stuff from, that's the point of the whole event, and at the same time it's methodologically elusive. In the study process, they are those moments of uncertainty, those in between phases, those interstices where something is at risk, and you try to do the suppressing of hierarchy, and you try to think beyond the boxes, try to reconfigure roles, and it might go well and it might not. And there's something interesting in that. And speculative gestures are plural by definition, and they are meant to evade being put into any methods toolbox, according to the kind of the underlying philosophical notion of speculation already. And you might disagree with this with me and others. I would be interested to hear how far can you actually methodologically fix or push speculative research. But then, and this is the point, methodological and ethical issues do arise that researchers and designers could address further. So although you're not making a method toolbox here, there still are some interesting issues to be think about and to be aware of and to share share through each other's experiences. And this is this I want to say as in terms of the knowledge production, and this is based on kind of the Whitehead's and Stengers's speculative philosophy, that even if you do embrace the idea of suppressment of hierarchy and various forms of knowledge production and trying to bring these together, not all knowledge is the same. Stengers refers to Whitehead in his example that the artist's perception is not more authentic, it's different. It's what happens when we bring together these different ways of knowing and experiencing, for example, nature, for example, biotechnologies, for example, the modification of the human body. And finally, a speculative approach, as Stengers reminds us, does not produce miracles. That's a good way to think about, at least for myself, that it's not even meant to do something radically different, but it does do something different in a sense that it invites us also to conduct some methodological observations. What is taking place in these gaps of uncertainty when we engage with research participants? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mianna. That was a lot of things to think about, and I'm constantly trying to kind of tie them up into like more concrete examples and like try to imagine how your cases were, and like illustrate them in a certain way. I was wondering if there are any questions. Maybe you can raise your hands.
Any questions, comments, disagreements, agreements, anything?
Guy and then Julia.
Hello there. Hi, it's Guy Julia from Tampere University Department of Design. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Guy.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And it was very timely for me because I'm going through my third reading of, I don't know if you know this article by Andrew Barry called What is an Environmental Problem in Theory, Culture and Society? Came out last year. Because he starts with Whitehead and Stengers as well. And I'm not very well versed in Whitehead and Stengers. And the question of the gap is really interesting to me because I'm sort of interested in how you conceptualize the shape of that gap. So if I could just quote page 3 from this, he's making a critique of STS, where he says, my suggestion is that the question of the problem has been dominated by thinking about the closed spaces of the laboratory and the clinic, as opposed to the relatively unbounded spaces of, for example, the depleted forest, the polluted city street, the contaminated mine, or the floodplain. So he's raising this question about what shape does that problem space have? Is it a sort of closed space, or is it a kind of amorphous, shapeless, very open thing? This might sound a bit abstract, my question, I suppose, but what consideration is given to, who does the defining of that gap? How is that gap defined? Is that a gap which is produced and manufactured like a lab space? Or is it to be discovered? And what if that gap is not just a gap, but something like a complex cave system, or a set of canyons? Okay, so it has multiple directions, multiple spaces of openness, if you like. Sorry if that's a terribly abstract question, but you just got me sort of thinking about these sorts of things.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks for the reference suggestion. I will definitely have to look look into that, and it's actually So we've been focusing on relations, on affect, on temporality, and the space. We haven't thought that much, or we haven't explicated it that much. I think following along with the original idea of interstice as being a very vague idea of something interesting is happening in between, we're trying to keep the gap very open. So we're trying to define it in that way that but maybe we need to rethink about conceptual or defining it a little bit further. That I think it depends on, as Barry suggests, it depends on the case you have, it depends on the site, it depends on the people you invite to do something. So it is, and I always come back to this idea of we actually had in the Creatures workshop that I was lucky enough to participate last week in Utrecht, a workshop that Lara and others held on audiences, of different understandings of audiences, and that kind of really underscored to me how this whole process is so relational, that you need to begin by seeing which entities are brought together to see where the gap happens. So maybe in the forest with some you could have human, but you can have more than human. You could have animal participants also. We've been playing with this idea. How do you take in other types of participants and how their experience could be involved? And so I think it is an open, it must be left as an open, to be defined issue. You can't have a definition of the gap, but it's supposed to help you to signify that here's something that happens in the in between space. Here's something unruly. I don't know whether this, and a complex cave system, definitely. I mean, it's artificial to say the gap. I think it's not very helpful, but somehow, and the reviewers have asked to fix on it, to do more work on that. So we have to work with it, although we want to leave it a little bit blurry.
Yeah, that is contingent and situated and possibly multiple, and
but it is something that is methodologically defined, under articulated also. So as people start generating more methodological ideas of speculative research and what goes on there, I suppose the gap starts getting more flesh. It can be filled with more, and then there's always a danger of someone saying, okay, this is a gap and this is not a gap. And then I don't know what happens.
Yes. Good, thanks very much.
Julia, you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mianna, and also thank you, Guy, for this brilliant question. I think it's very interesting because I think this is where design methods come in, because when you are engaging in a situation, and in a way the gap is that situation, you know, first of all, you do this assessment, you do this kind of stock taking of who's here, whose voices do we have, what needs shifting, or what needs the ability to think from a different perspective. And it's almost like constructing, it is almost like a scientific setup, apart from it having to be very loose, but you're trying to construct something that gives the possibility for people to see whatever they encounter on a daily basis from another perspective. And then it's very much, there's very much like a gut feeling that you have when you enter a situation that's very hard to articulate. And I think this is where it's so fruitful to work together with social scientists, with scientists, because we will ask the questions that you might not ask, Mianna, and you will ask the question that we might not ask. So we are kind of almost filling in each other's blind spots with acting together and surprising each other with how we articulate things, or how we don't articulate things, how we just do, or how we stop and question in moments. So it's very interesting to work together. I think this was maybe more comment than kind of a question, but it was raised again when you were articulating what Emilia is doing, and I would never have the words to articulate in this way. I'm kind of so even like working with Emilia together, it's very interesting because we look from different perspectives, we ask different questions, and yet it all makes sense when you kind of see it from these both points, like both is needed basically.
Yeah, I agree, and this is why it's nerve-wracking for me to work with you, because I am aware that we have different vocabularies, and yeah, let's see what
compliment.
Emilia's PhD. Guy will help us out there.
Lara, you want to ask?
Thanks. Yeah, I want to sort of ask about, for me, process philosophy, especially with Whitehead, is this wonderful way to take account of the natural environment that we haven't, that many of us here as moderns have kind of excluded from our kind of basic ontological worldview. And it's sort of like the way that we might use kind of Stenger's work in academic research to take account of things that aren't counted, like for me in environmental sensing, in air quality sensing, to really take into account the atmosphere, requires a set of tools for thinking beyond subjects and objects. And I sort of feel like working on creatures, many of the speculative works are kind of, a set of feelings that kind of process ontologies are in some way what we need more of. They're kind of like, not a solutionist, because that would be a really weird thing to say, but that actually the idea that encountering different forms of ontological worldviews through creative practice, that will kind of have the effect of asking us to step outside our own modern worldviews and to have some kind of impact. And I think that's a really interesting proposal, because what we're kind of trying to do is pointing towards a set of relations that we value and we want to move towards, and kind of asking people to think about or to experience those, on the way to something new. So it's sort of like, to what extent speculative practice around kind of process worldviews, they are a practice that happens in the now, but sort of to what end? So what are the situated practices doing? I think that's really interesting, because kind of, Mianna, your cases sort of sit across like some very practical ways of imagining the kind of future ethics of CRISPR, which feels like a very kind of concrete mode of thinking that could happen like along the normal ontological modernist worldview. And then this incredible case with like the reindeer herder futures that's kind of traveling towards something that's very much not modern. So I wondered like how you were thinking across your two really different types of cases.
Good, good points, and thank you. It's a very valid question. It's always a risk to pull together so different types of cases, but it really initially we try to not go too much, not even ourselves to think too deeply into the cases in this kind of methodological orientation or methodological reflection, but actually go a lot what Julia said about the gut feeling, that we kind of had this, speculative philosophy says that it's a lure for feeling, and we had this strange feelings across and after these cases and we try to tap into those moments of uneasiness, or that something happened there that didn't leave me alone, and I need to think whether I messed it up or the participants messed it up, or what happened there, and did I phrase the whole setting in somehow weird way and stuff like that. So often those kind of matters of or moments of concern might be the points into how to enter into these similarities of very different cases. So for example, it has been very important to us to acknowledge both in the focus group case on elderly people speaking about biotech futures and Emilia's reindeer herder, that in both cases, very different, completely constructed in kind of different, also in different settings and sites and geographical settings. Both of them were really about, the participants are really reluctant to look into future. So they kind of, we are left with hours of talk on past, on histories, and on spaces and materialities and bodily experiences and familial kind of intergenerational patterns of the past. And only through those could we then get to say something, or to somehow dig some holes into what do we want to say about the futures. And that was something interesting and something that joined these cases together, although they were very different. So I'm just, I guess my take-home message here is that go with the feelings of, and this is well known to you, but it's maybe not that appreciated in social science, in kind of strict methodological settings, that you have to have proper justifications why you focus on some issues and not others. But the gut feeling is a good one, and the uneasiness and the affective turbulence or something.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mianna. We are exactly on time. I was wondering if there is like one last super urgent question or not. Then I think closing with like trusting your gut feeling. Also, if you are a hardcore scientist, it's a very good message to like wrap up the session. Thank you so much, Mianna, for being with us today. It's been really nice to have you.
Thank you for the great comments. I'll go back to the paper and see you at some point. Thank you a lot.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Good luck with that. Bye.
Thank you.